Greetings. My name is Kyle Greenwald, and I'm the president of the John Dewey Society. This past week, on April 20, 2022, the John Dewey Society and the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society sponsored a special conference, a conference on border justice and inter-American cooperation, along with our colleagues at Alliance San Diego, the American Friends Service Committee of San Diego, and the Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego. This was a wonderful event, and we loved every second of it. We are especially excited today to create a special recorded version of one part of that conference, the 2022 John Dewey Memorial Lecture with Professor Christopher Tirres of DePaul University. I'm so happy and so excited that we can share this with you. Before I introduce our lecturer, I want to say a few words on why we're having this conference, on why specifically the John Dewey Society is focusing on these issues of border justice. John Dewey's social and political activism is well known. We know, for example, of the transformative impact the 1894 Pullman strike had on Dewey. The strike and its associated boycott against all trains that carried a Pullman car affected most rail lines west of Detroit, involved 250,000 workers in 27 states. Writing to his wife, Alice, Dewey damns the higher classes for failing to work toward a fully inclusive society based on equitable and shared ends. A second example. Dewey knew of the Springfield, Illinois race riot of 1908, an event of mass racial violence committed against African Americans by a mob of about 5,000 white Americans. In its wake, a group of white liberals, including Dewey, issued a call to, quote, all believers in democracy to join in a national conference for the discussion of present evils, the voicing of protests, and the renewal of the struggle for civil and political liberty, unquote. Released on the centenary of Lincoln's birth, this call founded the NAACP. Dewey would serve on the first executive board of the organization. These two examples can be put alongside many others, including in 1916, Dewey was among the founders of the American Federation of Teachers. In 1935, Dewey became a member of the United States section of the International League for Academic Freedom, and in 1940 helped to edit a series of articles related to the Bertrand Russell case. In 1937, Dewey directed the Commission in Mexico City, the Dewey Commission, which cleared Leon Trotsky of the charges made against him by Joseph Stalin. And in 1939, Dewey was elected president of the League for Industrial Democracy, an organization with the goal of educating college students about the labor movement. The student branch of the LID would later become Students for a Democratic Society. It is within the context of Dewey's social and political activism that we situated our 2022 annual meeting, the Conference on Border Justice and Inter-American Cooperation. So let's turn now to a few headlines, which we are probably all familiar. The U.S. Border Patrol reported more than 1.6 million encounter with migrants along the U.S.-Mexico border in 2021, more than quadruple the number of prior years and the highest annual total on record. Among those 1.6 million encounters are a record number of unaccompanied children. I want to talk about those children for just a minute. As Randy Mandelbaum, in an article from The Conversation, notes about these unaccompanied children, quote, in 2021, over 100,000 children left their countries and crossed the US-Mexico border without a parent or legal guardian, many escaping dangerous and/or exploitative situations back home. This exceeds the previous high seen in 2019. Behind these numbers are individual children, many of whom have suffered from repeated trauma. Legally, the US is obligated to care for these children from the moment they arrive until they turn 18, according to carefully defined procedures, unquote. Documenting the process of arrival in the first 72 hours after a child arrives at the border, Mandelbaum goes on to note, quote, government officials designate a child as unaccompanied if they are alone when they arrive at the border without lawful status. Alone is defined as without a parent or legal guardian. So even children who arrive with a grandparent or aunt are considered unaccompanied and separated from these caregivers. When an unaccompanied child first arrives, they are typically met by Customs and Border Patrol, a law enforcement unit of the Department of Homeland Security. Not met by teachers, not met by social workers, met by law enforcement. Border agents hand the child a piece of paper called a notice to appear in immigration court, meaning the US government has initiated deportation proceedings against the child. This happens even if the child has a viable asylum claim or other potential pathway to legal status in the US. By law, within 72 hours, all unaccompanied migrant children must be transferred to the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. As unaccompanied minor arrivals have soared this year, the Office of Refugee Resettlement has been unable to receive all children within 72 hours. Some children have remained for up to 10 days in Border Patrol holding cells that were never intended for the care of children, leading to the horrible images that we have all seen of children being kept in cages, sleeping on the floor, and not having ample food, soap, or even a toothbrush, unquote. So the inability of our institutions to welcome and care for children arriving at the US-Mexico border is an example of the sort of problem that Dewey believed philosophy needs to consider. That is, a problem grounded in the concrete particulars of our complex communal life. Such problems require more than a technocratic fix, however. That is, we need more than an efficient doling out of resources through the social safety net. For such problems to be addressed, as complex as they are, require the prior awakening of our moral imagination. That is, the problems surrounding the US-Mexican border will not receive the attention of our philosophical activity and of our activism if they do not first arouse our empathy, our compassion, and our sense of the need for justice, to find ways to have our minds challenged and our hearts broken. This is why it was vitally important to me as president of the John Dewey Society that we, along with our colleagues at the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society, organize this conference in the place and in the manner that we did. In coming to San Diego and having our conference in San Diego and at the Centro Cultural de la Raza, we have the duty to bear witness to the stories of migrants and unaccompanied children, the stories that we know from the headlines. But through the process of organizing this conference, I now understand in a way that I maybe did not first understand when I was organizing this conference, the need to better understand and to highlight the ways in which border militarization, white supremacy, and state violence against Indigenous, Black, and Latinx folks impact the lives of those already living in San Diego, and of course, the land itself. Dewey's theory of continuity has helped us, me specifically, better imagine some of the great evils produced by militarized borders, the affected social, temporal, and spatial isolation. The essential point, Dewey says in Democracy and Education, is that isolation makes for rigidity and formal institution of life, for static and selfish ideals within a group. That is, Dewey might be saying, borders literally make us less intelligent. They do so by tamping down on our imaginations. They cut us off from neighbors. And in the case of the Kumeyaay, the first inhabitants of that land, they are also cut off from family and ancestors. Such isolation reduces access to knowledge accumulated from centuries of experience living in a place, of living in harmony with the land and what the land can provide. By way of contrast, an expanding sphere of interaction, one that reduces the impact of militarized border regions, is one that embraces reconstructed histories and geographies, embraces interaction and learning, and ultimately embraces an alert and sensitive moral imagination. It recognizes and honors the Kumeyaay. It welcomes and protects the migrant and the unaccompanied child. It recognizes the fight for justice among the Raza. It fights anti-Blackness in all its forms. And it honors and protects a river that provides water for human and non-human animals in the San Diego region. So through the practices that we implemented in San Diego, including our land tax for the Kumeyaay and our border tour with the American Friends Service Committee, let us commit and recommit ourselves to the further awakening of our moral imaginations. Now, I want to turn to the main event. I'm especially proud and grateful to welcome today Dr. Christopher Tirres as our 2022 John Dewey Memorial Lecturer. Christopher is a Vincent DePaul Professor of Religious Studies and the Inaugural Endowed Professor of Diplomacy and Interreligious Engagement in the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University in Chicago. He directs DePaul's Center for Religion, Culture, and Community. Dr. Tirres is the author of The Aesthetics and Ethics of Faith, a dialogue between liberationist and pragmatic thought, Oxford 2014, as well as two forthcoming volumes. First, a monograph entitled Liberating Spiritualities in the Americas with Fordham University Press, and second, a co-edited volume entitled Religion in the Americas, Transcultural and Trans-hemispheric Approaches with the University of New Mexico Press. Dr. Tirres has published and presented widely in the area of religious studies, philosophy, theology, feminism, and education. Dr. Tirres is the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including major awards from the Ford Foundation, the Louisville Institute, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, and the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning. Dr. Tirres is an award-winning teacher, and he is involved in a number of community-engaged initiatives, both at DePaul and beyond. Most recently, he has collaborated with the Chicago-based Interfaith Community for Detained Immigrants, the Mariposa Foundation, which is a program based in the Dominican Republic that seeks to end generational poverty by educating and empowering girls, and Solidarity Bridge, an organization that partners with communities in Bolivia and Paraguay to increase access to safe, affordable surgery and other essential care. Chris Tirres was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, and is a graduate of Princeton University, Harvard Divinity School, and Harvard University. I am so pleased to welcome our 2022 John Dewey Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Christopher Tirres.
Thank you, Kyle. It is so good to be here today and to get to do this one more time. I want to thank you for that generous introduction and just say that I had such a fantastic time in San Diego with you and everyone else at the conference. It was such a special conference. It was special for me not only because the two organizations that sponsored the event are very close to my heart, the John Dewey Society and the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society, but it was also special because it took place at the Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, California. How cool is that? We were having these great conversations and learning from each other right in the heart of the Chicanada. So I want to just thank the organizers for their hard work and in particular for their vision to bring us together in such a compelling way that brought together educators and scholars, community activists and artists, and got us out onto the border tour and got us into the community. It was really, for me, a model how socially engaged and community engaged academic conferences can look like. So kudos to Kyle, to Jason from Lapis, and to all the other organizers for doing such a terrific job at the conference. My talk today is divided into two parts. In the first part, I will offer my own assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of John Dewey's philosophy of religion. While I find tremendously helpful Dewey's understanding of the religious dimensions of human experience, I lament the fact that he draws such a sharp divide between this naturally occurring sense of the religious and organized religion. The first section discusses the theoretical parameters of this problem. The second part of the lecture tells the story of how residents of El Paso, Texas, drew on spiritual resources, both informal and formal, to respond to a horrific episode of racially motivated violence. As I will show, the community of El Paso both corroborates key aspects of Dewey's understanding of the religious, as well as challenges certain shortcomings within it. I will also discuss the role that art and education can play in supporting spiritual healing and growth. I am honored once again to be addressing a multiplicity of audiences, which includes educators and philosophers, teachers, community folks, some of which I suspect will be from El Paso. My hope is that this presentation has something to offer everyone, and that you come away with some new ways of thinking about the connections between John Dewey and borderlands spirituality. Part 1. Reassessing John Dewey's understanding of the religious. In his 1934 book, A Common Faith, John Dewey distinguishes institutional religion from a naturally occurring sense of the religious. But what does he mean by this phrase, the religious? In answering this question, it may be helpful to first note that Dewey's overriding interest is in overcoming persistent philosophical dualisms. Dewey was no fan of the modern split between the individual and the world, mind and body, theory and practice, high art and low art, or even work and play. Dewey's desire to integrate pairings such as these may be partly explained by the experience of his own evangelical and pietistic religious upbringing, which was strictly enforced by his mother. Dewey reflects on his childhood experience in his 1938 autobiographical essay. There he describes, quote, a sense of divisions and separations that were, I suppose, borne in upon me as a consequence of a heritage of New England culture, end quote. These divisions, Dewey tells us, included a sense of isolation from the world, of soul from the body, of nature from God. Such separations give rise to what he describes as a painful oppression and an inward laceration. Such experiences significantly informed Dewey's lifelong desire to articulate a more unitive and holistic philosophy. It is important to note, however, that the inward laceration that Dewey experienced at home was somewhat mitigated by the liberal evangelicalism of his church. There, Dewey was exposed to the idea that Scripture need not be interpreted literally, that the Bible should be read in light of human experience, that spiritual growth happens not in isolation, but in community, and that Christianity was, above all, an ethical calling. Nevertheless, Dewey left organized religion in his mid-30s. This move coincided with his shift away from a Hegelian absolute idealism to a more pragmatic experimentalism and instrumentalism. Dewey was no longer caught up with the question of how Hegel's absolute was logically implied as a fact of experience. Instead, Dewey became increasingly interested in the concrete particulars of human life and the ways in which human intelligence can help to foment human flourishing. Although Dewey eventually moved away from the explicit language of symbols of Christian theology, several key religious insights remain constant throughout his life, including a quasi-Hegelian thirst for an overarching sense of unification, a defense of experience and intelligence as arbiters of truth, and an insistence that some of the most significant forms of religious faith are expressed through shared experience. Stephen Rockefeller, one of Dewey's foremost biographers, notes that Dewey's mature philosophy of religion, quote, developed into what, from the Christian theological point of view, one might call a radical version of the social gospel or a form of liberation theology. Inspired by the work of Rockefeller, Cornel West, and many others, my work has attempted to make explicit how Dewey's philosophy offers resources for contemporary liberation thinkers and vice versa. We can begin to see significant connections between Dewey's philosophy and liberation theology when we keep in mind that Dewey's philosophy was a significant advance upon earlier forms of empiricism. Like any good empiricist, Dewey eschews account of experience that are based on a priori, transcendental, or authoritative forms of reasoning. However, unlike earlier, more scientific empiricists who reduced empirical analysis to strictly rational or quantifiable measures, Dewey offers a non-reductionistic interpretation of experience that takes into account the qualitative dimensions of experience. For Dewey, a robust empiricism must also account for how we intuit and feel experience at a visceral, immediate, and pre-rational level. Notably, Dewey believes that, quote, experience actually presents aesthetic and moral traits, end quote, and that these traits are as relevant to the philosophical theory of nature as are the traits found by physical inquiry. Significantly, the two ideal traits that Dewey most often mentions throughout his work, aesthetic and moral traits, are precisely the two traits that inform his understanding of the religious dimensions of human experience, which he simply calls the religious. For Dewey, the religious is morality touched by emotion, or we could say aesthetics touched by ethics. Similarly, Dewey characterizes the religious both in terms of the aesthetic category of natural piety, as well as the ethical category of moral faith. For our purposes, the important point is that Dewey, a non-reductionistic empiricist, understands aesthetic and moral traits as inherent and integral aspects of actual experience. Liberation theology has followed a similar integralist approach, owing largely to the work of Karl Rahner and thinkers of the Nouvelle Théologie. For theologians such as these, there is no fundamental separation between the natural and the supernatural, nature and grace, salvation and history. Rather, these things are mutually constitutive parts of a single historical reality. Another major strength of Dewey's philosophy of religion is the attention he gives to religious faith as a form of human praxis. Both liberation theologians and Dewey underscore the centrality of human praxis in the transformation of the world. Liberation theology affirms the primacy of historical action. It recovers the biblical notion of doing the truth. Dewey expresses a similar sentiment in his discussion of moral faith, which is practical, not primarily intellectual. Of course, Dewey acknowledges that moral faith still requires some degree of intellectual reflection, but he underscores that moral faith still requires, but he underscores that faith, the fact that the religious ideals of moral faith are not antecedently existing actualities, but rather powerful human constructions that help to guide our actions. Dewey believes that when we use our intelligence to realize this fact, we clarify and deepen our engagement with moral faith. Finally, liberation theology and Dewey share a common interest in what Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, describes as humankind's total response to God. For Gutierrez, faith is less, quote, the simple affirmation, almost memorization of truths, and more a, quote, commitment, an overall attitude, a particular posture in life. This is faith and spirituality in their widest sense. In a similar way, Dewey extols the virtues of an enduring attitude that is religious in quality. Dewey describes this attitude as religious adjustment. Adjustment, he explains, entails inclusive and deep-seated changes in ourselves in relation to the world in which we live. Adjustment affects, quote, our being in its entirety. For Dewey, this comprehensive attitude is much broader than anything indicated by moral in its usual sense. Rather, adjustment exemplifies a morality at its most extensive reach, that is, as the totality of habits and action that give us meaningful orientations in life. In short, Dewey's pragmatism offers liberation thought helpful insights into the fundamental components that comprise religious adjustment, including habits, ideals, and human intelligence. Now, all of this said, there are places in Dewey's philosophy of religion where critical interrogation is needed. A cluster of shortcomings emerge out of Dewey's unfortunately sharp divide between the religious and institutional religion. For Dewey, a naturally occurring sense of the religious is altogether distinct from the strictures of institutional religion. Religion versus the religious, he titles the first chapter of A Common Faith. On the one hand, this distinction helps to clear some new ground in the way that we think about the religious dimensions of human experience. As Dewey convincingly argues, the religious dimension of human experience should be understood as the effect produced when human beings undergo a fundamental adjustment or reorientation in life, rather than as the manner and cause of its production. In other words, the way in which an experience operates or functions is what determines its religious value. Dewey further argues, with good reason, that institutional religions often claim that they are the ones to effect this enduring change in attitude. Dewey ingeniously turns this statement around and says that, quote, it is not a religion that brings this change about, but when it occurs, from whatever cause and by whatever means, there is a religious outlook and function. In a sense, what Dewey is doing here is that he is radically democratizing the religious dimension of human experience so that it is not the sole purview of institutional religions. Instead, he shows that the religious can emerge organically in any and all experience. Dewey's rethinking of the religious is undoubtedly significant and influential, especially when we connect it to our contemporary language of spirituality. However, I believe that Dewey misses a golden opportunity here to think about the ways in which institutional religion can actually help to promote what he describes as the religious. I find him all too quick to assume that institutional religion has little, if anything, to offer us in cultivating a sense of the religious, pragmatically understood. Dewey is prone, I believe, to generalize about institutional religion. I argue instead that we must instead be willing to probe Dewey's sense of the religious through the particularities of concrete faith expressions, which is what I will be doing shortly in my remarks about El Paso. Indeed, when we take a good look at particular religious histories, movements, theological subtraditions, and actual communities, we see how new pragmatic constellations may begin to emerge. Dewey's sharp divide between the religious and institutional religion is reinforced by his mostly warranted, yet at times overzealous critique of religious supernaturalism. While, as Reinhold Niebuhr correctly argues, Dewey sorely mischaracterizes more prophetic forms of religion. The God of truly prophetic religion, writes Niebuhr, is, quote, not a separate existence, but the ground of existence. As such, Niebuhr sees no necessary antinomy between prophetic strains of institutional religion and the inevitable paradoxes of faith. A number of other contemporary theologians and philosophers have echoed Niebuhr's sentiment. While many do not deny Dewey's claim that institutional religion may, at its worst, lead to social acquiescence, a growing chorus of scholars rightly recognizes that certain prophetic forms of institutional religion may indeed lead to richer, more meaningful, and more just forms of life. Key religious movements in the last 50 years, including the Civil Rights Movement, Vatican II, liberation theology, socially engaged Buddhism, various interfaith dialogue efforts, and a host of other examples serve as a testament to this possibility. And just as Dewey's critique of supernaturalism lacks some nuance, his philosophy of religion begs for a more grounded and, I would say, empirical approach. As Hans Joas points out, quote, in stark contrast to his constant efforts to circumvent all abrupt dualisms, Dewey sets institutionalized religion against the free-floating religious in the experience of democracy without seeking to mediate between them. Joas further notes that Dewey never sufficiently devoted himself to studying the history and sociology of religion. Had he done so, Dewey might have seen that rather than being an obstacle to intellectual and moral progress, religion has in fact often been a crucial catalyst. I agree with Joas here and would add that one of the great ironies in reading Dewey's philosophy of religion is the striking absence of key aspects of his educational theory, which is of special relevance for the conference that we just had. In his educational writings, Dewey consistently addresses the needs of the learner in developmentalist terms. He frequently insists that the educator must not force subject matter upon the learner. Rather, the educator must meet people wherever they are, so that they may grow at their own pace. He writes, for example, that the job of the educator is, quote, to select those things within the learner's range of existing experience that have the promise and potentiality of presenting new problems which by stimulating new ways of observation and judgment will expand the area of further experience. He continues, connectedness in growth must be the educator's constant watchword. In A Common Faith, however, Dewey often seems to fall short of his own educational standards. Rather than forge a connectedness and growth between inherited understandings of religious language and symbols on the one hand, and new and better ways of interpreting them on the other, Dewey often seems more inclined to announce a sharp disconnect between the religious and religion. Along similar lines, Dewey is highly suspicious of top-down forms of religious leadership. Despite its title, A Common Faith gives scant attention to religious faith as it is socially manifested, and it gives even less attention to the salutary role that religious educators may serve. Dewey dwells so much on the negative aspects of traditional religious communities that he fails on my reading to appreciate that one viable alternative to what he calls a community of spiritual aristocrats is not the dissolution of community as such, but rather the creation of a different kind of spiritual community. That is, one that is less aristocratic and more democratic. In short, Dewey does not consider the possibility that traditional religions may responsibly educate adherents in a way that, in fact, promotes his own sense of the religious. We must therefore question the stridency with which Dewey critiques institutional religion. At various points, he seems so definitive in his rejection of it that he leaves little, if any, room for mediating between his own sense of the religious and more traditional expressions of religion. Given that the majority of the two-thirds world today continues to turn to institutional forms of religion for direction and guidance, some common ground is indeed needed. What follows is my own fallible attempt to create some space for a more inclusive vision. Part 2. Spirituality abounds in the borderlands. Like Dewey, my ideas about religion first took root in my childhood. However, unlike Dewey, I come from a city that is 83% Latinx and around 80% Catholic. From an early age, it was both easy and natural for me to value my Mexican American culture. My parents had me, the first of 4 children, when they were students at the University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP, in the early 1970s. They were part of a burgeoning Chicano movement of the era. As my parents like to tell the story, my first words as a toddler were uttered at a student rally when, sitting atop my father's shoulders, I raised my fist high and boldly shouted, what else could I shout but Chicano power? Of course, those probably weren't my actual first words, but it sure does make for a good story, doesn't it? In addition to being shaped by my parents' activism, my early years were shaped by religion. My parents were active in the Catholic charismatic renewal movement, which began in the late 60s, just a few years after the momentous changes of Vatican II. In the words of one priest, which to many listeners might sound very pragmatic, this movement energized Catholics to think of Jesus Christ as, quote, no longer just a set of theses and dogmas, no longer just an object of worship and of remembrance, but a living reality in the Spirit, end quote. The movement style of worship took several cues from American Protestantism, especially Pentecostalism, and often featured uplifted hands during songs, audible praying, and even speaking in tongues. Prayer meetings outside of church were also commonplace. My parents would often drag me to prayer meetings where I would witness Bible discussions, testimonies, healing, glossolalia, and of course, lots of post-Vatican II folksy guitar music. My family also attended a Catholic church that was culturally welcoming and acutely attuned to issues of social justice. Our parish priest for the majority of my childhood was Father Arturo Banuelas, a socially engaged pastor and theologian whose work has been celebrated both locally and nationally. Although I couldn't articulate it at the time, Banuelas was exposing our church community to some of the best insights of Vatican II and to the best insights of the Catholic social tradition. His homilies never named these things as such, but through his remarkable storytelling and accessible language, he oriented us to a new way of living out our faith. Indeed, it was only when Banuelas left for Rome for a couple of years to complete his doctorate that I saw a much more conventional and, quite frankly, dull and uninspiring side of Catholicism. During those years, my family ended up attending a more affluent church that was closer to our home, led by a very clerical and strict white pastor. The church was spiritually hollow and devoid of a sense of the prophetic. This experience made me realize what a difference a single religious educator could make in the life of a faith community. As a religious studies major in college, I gained greater insight into Vatican II, Catholic social tradition, and liberation theology, and I began to appreciate just how vast and varied human spirituality has been throughout history and continues to be throughout the world. The study of religion helped me both to make sense of my own religious upbringing as a child and to deprovincialize my own religious orientation through my exposure to countless other ways of being religious. Today, my learning continues. And in the fall of 2021, I had an opportunity to see my community and their expressions of spirituality in a new light. It was then that I returned to El Paso as a part of an educational delegation that was to bear witness to the 2-year anniversary of a horrific mass shooting that took place 2 years before. On August 3rd, 2019, a white man drove 10 hours, 650 miles across the state of Texas to inflict harm on Mexican Americans and Mexicans who he believed were contributing to, quote, the Hispanic invasion of Texas. With an AK-47 style rifle, he opened fire on shoppers at an El Paso Walmart, killing 23 people and injuring 23 others. The incident has been called the worst attack in recent US history on the Latinx community. What I'd like to share now is the story of El Paso's response to racial violence and hatred, focusing in particular on the educative role that spirituality and art played in promoting healing. So I'm going to tell this story in 4 acts. Act 1 describes how El Pasoans responded to hate. Act 2 recounts how educators and artists outside of El Paso were moved and motivated by what happened. Act 3 explores the role of art in bearing witness to various forms of adversity. And Act 4 recounts how El Pasoans and their allies honored loss and honored the loss of lives and promoted healing through ritual. In all 4 of these acts, spirituality, art, culture, and education are consistent threads. But before I go any further, perhaps I should say a word or two what I mean here by spirituality. Here's a useful definition by the eminent Jesuit theologian Roger Haight, who describes spirituality as, quote, a quality of a person's or group's pattern of living insofar as it is measured before some ultimate reality. This is a very expansive definition of spirituality that carries echoes of John Dewey, Paul Tillich, Charles Long, and I like it for that reason. Haight, like Dewey, believes that spirituality can emerge in many forms, including art, nature, and everyday living. But unlike Dewey, Haight contends that we can also find powerful expressions of spirituality within prophetic religion. And I agree with this claim. In what follows, I will show how in El Paso, a variety of spiritual responses emerged, some from within institutional religion, and some as everyday expressions of ritual, art, and socially engaged education. Act 1, responding to hate. Very soon after the 2019 mass shooting, El Paso Congresswoman Veronica Escobar addressed El Pasoans, stating unequivocally that the incident was, quote, a racially motivated terrorist attack on our safe and tranquil community, end quote. And that, quote, the shooter came into our community because we are an Hispanic community, because we have immigrants here. He came here to harm us, end quote. How did El Pasoans respond? Within days of the shooting, El Pasoans came together to erect makeshift shrines and to hold a number of impromptu vigils, both day and night. El Pasoans shared their love with their community by creating homemade signs that said things like 915 United, a reference to El Paso's area code. And as we see at the top left here, El Paso is familia. When one hurts, we all hurt. El Paso strong. The images on the right capture the shrines that were created outside of the El Paso Walmart, a small replica of which is now part of the permanent exhibit at the El Paso Museum of History. All of these examples, which include impromptu community gatherings, prayer services, makeshift shrines, messages on poster boards, social media hashtags, wooden crosses, personal notes to loved ones, offerings of flowers and other gifts, all of that speaks to the many ways in which El Pasoans came together on their own as a community to memorialize and to make sense of this suffering through the collective form of ritual. I think Dewey would appreciate all of this as deep expressions of shared experience. In the months that followed, the El Paso County government formally spearheaded other community-wide initiatives, one of which was to be the creation of the El Paso Healing Garden, a memorial that would honor the victims and serve as a place for healing. Because of COVID-19, the project was delayed by a year, but under the leadership of Ricardo Samaniego, the El Paso County judge, the El Paso County government continued to work on this project. And pictured here is Samaniego at the Healing Garden just before it was completed in 2022. As an aside, here are some pictures of a mural that is at the El Paso County Government Office Building, which gives you a sense of how El Paso celebrates art and culture even in highly civic spaces. But back to the Healing Garden. There was an outpouring of support from local businesses to both fund the project and to provide physical labor to help construct it. El Paso artists also designed a unique symbol for the Healing Garden, a lotus flower that is particular to El Paso's circumstances. As explained on the county website, the lotus has a unique life cycle. Quote, Its roots based in mud are tragedy. It miraculously reblooms every morning without residue on petals, our strength restored. We created this symbol, the website continues, with 23 loops to signify the victims who lost their lives in the shooting. We added a shining yellow star to signify our resilience and hope. And in fact, for those of you who have driven through El Paso, you know that there's a very large star on the Franklin Mountains, which is a symbol of El Paso, longstanding symbol of El Paso. In addition to spearheading the Healing Garden, the El Paso County also promoted a month of unity and healing from July 3rd to August 3rd, 2021. Here are just a few examples that they listed on their website, which include art exhibits, virtual and live events promoting health and wellness, and an incredible documentary film screening on the role of art, music, and education in the United Farm Workers Movement. And as an aside, on May 4th, very soon, DePaul University will be hosting a free virtual screening of this remarkable documentary, and on May 5th, which is Cinco de Mayo, we will also be hosting a panel discussion about this documentary film that will feature Dolores Huerta, the film directors, and many of the educators that I'll be speaking about shortly. And everyone, if you see this video before May 4th and 5th, 2022, everyone is invited. And I'll make sure that the John Dewey Society and LAPES put out that information on the respective websites. All of these examples speak to how everyday El Pasoans and civic leaders responded to the tragedy of August 3rd, 2019. Through a religious studies lens, we see El Pasoans participating in collective ritual, creating shared symbols and accompanying one another in numerous forms of shared experience, all outside of formal religious institutions. These examples point in the direction of Dewey's naturally occurring sense of the religious. But the story of El Paso's response to racial violence also included formal religious responses as well. Religious leaders throughout the community often led prayers at the impromptu vigils. Priests, pastors, rabbis, and imams discussed the tragedy in their weekend sermons, and various faith traditions came together to work in very public ways toward the city's collective healing. Of special note, the Catholic Bishop of El Paso, Mark Seitz, wrote a remarkable pastoral letter entitled "Night Will Be No More," which was the first major statement from the Catholic Church at large on the theme of racism from the perspective of the border. The letter connects the El Paso shooting to historical racism along the border and to the recent resurgence of racism against the Latinx community in the United States, which is still very much alive and well, unfortunately. But Bishop Seitz's letter is an incredible letter that names and addresses racism and white supremacy. And if you have any interest in reading it, I recommend it in its entirety. Pictured here on the Pastoral Letters webpage are Matachines dancers. This is a centuries-old dance form that melds Spanish and indigenous elements into its veneration of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, whose image appears in multiple places. If you look closely, she's on the flag, she's on the vestments that they're wearing, she's on the headdresses. These photos help to illustrate how Borderlands Catholicism, in its attempt to lift up the lowly, continues to pay its respect to indigenous practices that date back centuries. And I also forgot to mention that the fence there is the border fence. So they're doing this ritual at the border fence. Act 2, sharing El Paso's story. The tragedy in El Paso, which some refer to as a matanza or mass slaughter, reverberated throughout the country and the world. One person who was especially impacted by this racially motivated act of aggression was David Carrasco, an historian of religion and anthropologist at Harvard University and a former teacher of mine, who also has very close ties to El Paso. Carrasco's grandfather, Miguel Carrasco, founded a vocational school in 1923 for the children of Mexican contract workers who came to work in a lead and copper smelter plant right outside of El Paso. David's father, David Sr., pictured on this mural, was another celebrated El Paso educator who founded and directed the El Paso Job Corps Center for over 20 years, which provided career technical training program, which was a career technical training program to underserved young adults at no cost. To this day, many generations of El Pasoans continue to speak fondly of David Sr.'s impact on them and the community. A few months after the mass shooting, David Carrasco Jr., my former teacher, returned to El Paso to visit his mother and to visit the site of the mass shooting. He writes about this experience in an essay entitled Saying the Mexican Names. And here he is standing outside of the El Paso Walmart. You'll notice that he is directly in front of a 30-foot grand candela or candle that was constructed as a memorial to the victims. But if you read this essay in its entirety, you'll learn that Carrasco laments the fact that the memorial did not actually mention any of the victims' names. Instead, at the time of his visit, a memorial plaque paid a somewhat generic tribute to those who lost their lives on August 3rd. Carrasco's point in this essay is to underscore the urgency of remembering the victims' names because the vast majority of them are Mexican names. Carrasco echoes Congresswoman Escobar's earlier point that these people were targeted because they have Mexican names. In this beautiful essay, Carrasco's prose slides into a kind of poetic litany in which he reverentially intones their Mexican names, thereby honoring their precious lives. As it turns out, one of Carrasco's old college friends, an artist by the name of Ellen Elms, who lives in Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, reads this essay, and she is so inspired by his call to say the Mexican names that she decides to paint a portrait of each of the victims. Ellen Elms, pictured here with her husband Don Elms, paints 23 portraits over 23 consecutive days. She writes their full name above their image, and below each face, she adds a legendary, mythical, or cultural meaning to each of the names. After completing these marvelous paintings, Ellen doesn't know what to do with them. So she reaches out to Carrasco to inquire if there is any way that she might be able to give them to the families of the deceased. Carrasco then contacts the district attorney, Jaime Esparza, who was in charge of this case and who had been working closely with the families. Esparza is moved deeply by these paintings, and in a tremendous display of care and love, he hand delivers the paintings to each of the families. Act 3, bearing witness to adversity. In the fall of 2020, I was honored to be invited by Judge Samaniego and David Carrasco to be part of a small group of educators to help the judge's office prepare for the 2-year anniversary of this mass shooting. Our group had regular Zoom meetings with Judge Samaniego and his staff, And because of this, we and about 5 other educators, including Ellen Elms, were invited to attend the dedication ceremony for the El Paso Healing Garden and to participate in other events that Memorial Weekend. I'd like to focus here on 2 of those events. The day before the Healing Garden dedication ceremony, our educational delegation was given a wonderful tour of mural art in the Segundo Barrio area of El Paso, located just south of downtown. Our guide was the really talented local graffiti and mural artist by the name of Jesus Alvarado, who goes by the nickname Simi. The tour impacted me greatly. It helped me to see how the educational function of art can help give rise to implicit forms of spirituality. El Paso murals teach people about what it means to live in a community that has long borne witness to adversity. The art also models for the community how it is entirely possible and even desirable to simultaneously embrace a diversity of cultural and religious worldviews. To many outside of El Paso, this might seem logically inconsistent or scattered, but most El Pasoans, I would submit, are like Walt Whitman. They are large and they contain multitudes. Or, in the words of theologian Roberto Goizueta, they know how to live life in the subjunctive. Such an orientation, of course, has spiritual implications. Recalling Roger Haight's earlier definition of spirituality, El Paso mural art reflects life as it is qualitatively lived in this community, revealing multiple and diverse worldviews and patterns of living that point in the direction of ultimate values like justice and hope. Let's look at some examples of how this is so. Here we have Simi in his studio. The image directly to his left or right is a painting of a Mexican woman holding a torch like Lady Liberty, a potent symbol of justice. But notice also what is in back of her. On her right side, our left, translucent rays shine forth behind her. These rays pay tribute to the dazzling rays of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, who I mentioned earlier. And in back of her, to her left, is a stone carving of an Aztec goddess, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess. The important point here is that we see a melding of Catholic and indigenous imagery, much like we saw earlier with the Matechines dancers. Furthermore, all of this is framed within a larger imaginary of cosmic justice. After all, the words etched on the Statue of Liberty are as applicable to Lady Liberty as they are to Guadalupe. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Here is a large mural that Simi painted of 2 local conjunto musicians. We once again witness a mashup of cultural imagery, a Spanish colonial church on the top right of the mural and another Aztec glyph running along its bottom edge. And of course, thrown into the mix are present day realities, such as 2 migrants walking along the train tracks toward the northern frontera in search of a better future, as well as a touching image of a grandmother washing her grandson in a large wash basin as he pretends to shave. As Simi explained to us, this is emblematic of many Mexican-American boys growing up in the Segundo Barrio area of El Paso, who, because of their challenging circumstances, are forced to grow up all too quickly. Here we see a mural by Ramon and Christian Cárdenas of the region's 2 sister cities, Ciudad Juárez, Mexico on the left and El Paso on the right. Below them are buildings from their respective cities, with the Rio Grande running fluidly in between them. The girls' braids intertwine, and they share similar facial features with the Aztec jaguar that hovers above them. Like so many other murals in the Segundo Barrio, this painting shows just how entwined and porous these two communities are. Christian Apodaca painted this marvelous mural of a beautiful woman emerging out of the desert cactus. Notice how at home she is amidst the prickly cactus needles. For me, this mural signifies a steely determination and resilience amidst the challenging circumstances of the desert. The mural on the left, painted by Simi, is entitled Fronterizos, which means border people, and features a local mariachi musician and an indigenous woman from the Tarahumara community of northern Mexico. The black and white murals on the right, done by Simi and other artists, give you a sense of the El Paso style and humor. Here we have RoboCop in his rigid armor attempting somewhat awkwardly to eat a delicious but ever so delicate flauta. And here is Lucy from Peanuts advertising that for only 5 cents, or is it 5 centavos, you can get a refreshing agua de limon. These last two examples speak to the Chicano sensibility known as rascuachismo, which hybridizes, juxtaposes, and integrates things as a means of empowerment and resilience. Rascuachismo makes the most from the least, and it often involves inventing new uses for conventional objects. I could easily see a discussion of Rascuachismo in an updated Borderlands version of Dewey's Art as Experience. I think you would like this idea. Here's an older mural that is painted on the wall of a multifunction space that is part of the Sacred Heart Parish, a church that was established by a group of Jesuits more than 125 years ago. There are a lot of details here, but let me call your attention to just a few. First, a man carries a woman on his shoulders across the Rio Grande from Mexico to the United States. Presumably, this is happening at night, because here you have Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe lighting the way for them with a flashlight. And on the other side, we have a priest riding a red bike. This is Father Ram, an icon of El Paso, originally from Brazil, who passed away in 2019 at the age of 100. In the 1950s, Father Ram would ride his bike around the Segundo Barrio, stopping to talk to people in the neighborhood, including gang members. He became known as the bicycle priest. As one El Paso luminary puts it, quote, "He had so much charisma. He was humble and genuine, and he went around the neighborhood identifying issues. You could say he was one of the first that gave publicity to the substandard housing in South El Paso, the poverty and the health issues. He addressed all of that," end quote. This green wall serves as a kind of musical history of what was happening in El Paso in the 50s and 60s. You'll notice a number of rock and roll bands featuring both Mexican-American and African-American musicians. And there's a small image that I've enlarged on the right-hand side, which shows Father Ram shaking hands with one of the bands. In fact, it was Father Ram who came up with the idea to start a battle of the bands in El Paso to keep young men off the street and to promote racial understanding and cooperation. And in 2015, Simi painted the more recent mural right below that. In looking at all these and other murals, I am struck by two things. First, we see a remarkable receptiveness to cultural hybridity. This art celebrates the plurality of experiences and cultures that exist in El Paso. It's a creative blending of different influences, including indigenous, Spanish, ancient, contemporary, American, Mexican, African American, futuristic, comedic. Whether these influences overlap or interpenetrate, El Pasoans have learned to embrace them all. Second, I am struck by the ways in which many muralists in El Paso seamlessly weave religious iconography into their work. It is no secret that many Chicano artists and activists throughout the United States have viewed institutional churches as colonizing agents that have contributed to the systematic oppression of indigenous people and other people of color. Such critiques are absolutely warranted. After all, we cannot ignore the fact that for over 500 years, institutional religion in the Americas has often been more death-dealing than it is life-affirming. Death-dealing in its neglect and even disdain of Black and brown bodies, death-dealing in its pernicious forms of patriarchy, heteronormativity, and anthropocentrism, and death-dealing in its relentless promotion of the myth of American exceptionalism at the expense of indigenous livelihoods and lands. And yet, within the vast and complex reality that Dewey and others at times all too conveniently abstract as religion or the church, we should not forget that there have always been particular individuals, particular churches, and particular faith communities that have patterned their lives on behalf of those on the underside of history. Though such examples may represent only a sliver of what religion has actually come to be in the Americas, the incredible lives of people like Antonio de Montesinos, Bartolomé de las Casas, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Rutilio Grande, and Oscar Romero are certainly not forgotten. El Pasoans living in the Segundo Barrio understand this because they have their own icons, including Father Ram and many other Jesuits in the community, and the ever-present symbol of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. Street artists and community educators like Simi Alvarado recognize just how important figures like these have been to the life of the community. And they have no difficulty juxtaposing Guadalupe alongside an Aztec goddess or Father Ram along rock and roll bands. In El Paso, such a juxtaposition makes sense because all of these things speak genuinely to the lived experience of the community. Artists like Simi help us to see that in a border city like El Paso, there need not exist a sharp divide between religion and the religious. Act 4, honoring lives, nurturing healing. We arrive finally at the dedication ceremony of the El Paso Healing Garden, a ceremony that reflected El Paso's continuing desire to heal. Like the mural art of the Segundo Barrio, the event reflected the cultural and religious diversity of El Paso. Among other things, the ceremony featured a beautiful performance by El Paso's own internationally renowned cellist, Zuil Bailey, an invocation by a leading Christian pastor, a statement about binational unity offered by a dignitary from Mexico's Secretariat of Foreign Relations, a reading of the names by 2 members of the Interfaith Alliance of the Southwest, and a ritual blessing of the memorial by El Paso's Catholic bishop. This display of diversity was symbolically stunning. In addition, The honored guest speaker was civil rights activist Dolores Huerta, a longtime friend of El Paso. And the day before the event, the comedian George Lopez sent word that he wanted to say a few words at the event as well. Like Huerta, Lopez was invested in this community. In fact, within days of the shooting in 2019, Lopez traveled to El Paso to comfort the families of the victims. At the Healing Garden ceremony, both Huerta and Lopez delivered remarks that were heartfelt and uplifting. And here is the monument itself. Along the semicircle on the left are plaques with names of each of the individuals who were killed along with the lotus flower symbol. Like this symbol, the lighting at the memorial service was yet another example of ingenious design and artistry. These lights shot straight up into the night sky, probably 100, 200 feet. The lights were mostly stationary, but then, after a few minutes, they would slowly begin to converge into a giant half cone. And when you saw those lights, you couldn't help but look up. From an architectural point of view, the lights created an experience that was like entering a cathedral in the great outdoors. And in looking up to the skies and looking up to the heavens, one was reminded that this was indeed a sacred space. Ellen Elms, Dolores Huerta, and George Lopez spent well over an hour after the event just talking to and sitting with various family members, a sign of their deep respect and love for this community. And of course, other family members quietly huddled with one another, comforting each other. The last thing I would like to say about this evening is this. When all of the speeches were finished and everyone walked over to the Healing Garden area to observe the ribbon cutting and to see the monument, I had to stay back just to process everything. I just needed some time to myself. And as I was sitting there reflecting, Jaime Esparza, the district attorney who was in charge of the case, came over and sat down next to me. He had apparently stayed back to process things as well. We started chatting, and he told me something that I'll never forget. He said, "Do you know why I think that El Paso has reacted in the way that we have? That's not about vengeance, not about hatred, but mostly about healing." "Why is that?" I asked. And he said, "I think it's because of our culture, because we know how to treat people with dignity, and we know how to take care of each other. That's why we've had the response that we've had." And that insight really grabbed me. It spoke to the sense of a deep-rooted spirituality, a communal spirituality of accompaniment that exists in a border town like El Paso, a community that knows how to take care of one another. In closing, what do parts 1 and 2 of my talk have to do with one another? On the one hand, Dewey gives us a lens through which to understand El Paso's response to a profound tragedy. He shows us that spirituality can emerge anywhere. In El Paso, we have seen spirituality emerge organically in impromptu vigils and unique symbols, in small paintings and large murals, in civic events, and in everyday acts of solidarity and accompaniment. In short, we have seen how spirituality can emerge in any significant expression of shared experience. Dewey's understanding of education is also profoundly helpful here, even if it is somewhat buried in his book on religion. all of the people that I have mentioned today, including artists, musicians, civic leaders, priests, pastors, bishops, teachers, civil rights activists, comedians, and many, many others, were implicitly engaged in deep processes of education and spiritual healing. In Democracy and Education, Dewey offers one of his most specific definitions of education. Education, he writes, is, quote, the reconstruction or reorganization of experience, which adds to the meaning of experience and which increases ability to direct the course of subsequent experience. Education, in this sense, applies to all aspects of our lives, and it sheds light on Dewey's oft-quoted remark that, quote, education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. All of the protagonists in this story, both inside and outside of El Paso, are, in their own right, educators and spiritual healers, insofar that they have helped to reconstruct experience in ways that not only give meaning to tragedy, but also through their creative acts of art, ritual, symbol, and solidarity, they have helped give birth to new possibilities of shared value and purpose. In addition to showing what Dewey has to offer, I hope I have also made clear that El Paso has much to teach Dewey. Dewey can learn a thing or two from El Paso, and that's why I like this image here. He's learning a thing or two about the art, about the people, inside and outside of El Paso. As El Paso shows, a naturally occurring sense of the religious need not automatically be antithetical to more institutional forms of religion, particularly those with prophetic orientations. Rather, we have seen that when creatively engaged and reconstructed, inherited and hybrid religious narratives, rituals, and symbols can help give rise to liberating forms of spirituality. Out of a dark moment, a community responded in life-giving ways that continue to yield new and richer experience. Through countless acts of creativity and accompaniment, El Pasoans exemplify in very real ways what a common faith in the fullness of life can actually look like. And at the end of the day, when night has fallen and when tragedy has crept in, El Paso's common faith has everything to do with this community's long-standing ability and ongoing desire to care for one another. Thank you.
Chris, on behalf of the John Dewey Society, let me thank you for delivering this beautiful 2022 John Dewey Memorial Lecture. Truly a love letter to El Paso and a gift to all of us in our work as activists and scholars and educators. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for viewing this lecture. Have a great day.